to speak on partly from her thesis on financial liberalization in Mexico, and also from her article in Relay last year on the corn crisis and market disciplines. Hepzibah?
So I'm going to focus on monetary policy under Calderon, and basically, in a way, under Calderon's administration, monetary policy has been used even more as a disciplinary mechanism particularly over labor. And I was watching the news last week on the internet, Mexican news, and people were interviewed because there was this price hike of gasoline, again, corn, wheat, and what else? And milk. Chicken or something, milk. And people were interviewed and they were asked, now what are you going to do? And the response was, I don't know, I think I'm going to have to get another job, work harder. And there's other people that were interviewed in the market and they said, well, now I have to eat less, I have to buy less meat because, yeah, I don't have enough money to pay for the amount of meat or tortillas that I used to buy before. So for me, that's very telling of how anti-inflationary monetary policies have become a disciplinary mechanism over labor to increase productivity at a very low cost. This is also the case of the example I'm going to give you, which is the corn crisis or the tortilla crisis in Mexico in the early days of the Calderon administration. And before I continue with that, I think by looking at monetary policy and looking at these pressures over labor, we can actually question the so-called transition to democracy in Mexico, which is usually it's characterized by mainstream academia as a triumph of the PAN in 2000 and the 2000 presidential election. So going back to the case of the tortilla crisis or the corn crisis, just to give you a very brief summary of what happened is that tortilla prices in the early days of 2007 increased more than 50%. What's interesting here is that what is very okay. What was interesting about this is that prices increased, but wages stayed almost the same. Also, tortillas. Why I'm focusing on this is because tortillas are 50% or half of the source of calories of poor people in Mexico, which are about 50 million people, poor people in Mexico. So lots of people were arguing that this increase in prices was because of the high demand for corn to produce ethanol in foreign markets. And yeah, that's partly true, but how can we explain that the price of corn in Mexico was 100% higher than the increase of prices in the Chicago trades of future market? So the way we can explain this is by looking at what happened within the Mexican nation state. What happened in terms of class relations? What were the reforms that the state took to make a couple of corporations very powerful in the distribution and commercialization of corn within Mexico? So also the state, one of the measures that that increased the power of corporations in their distribution and commercialization of corn was the privatization of communal land and the removal of social programs aimed at the distribution of grains such as corn and beans. So the removal or the privatization of land or communal land or ejidos led to the concentration of agricultural production in few hands, and also it led to a decline in subsistence agriculture. So people started depending more on the market instead of their own self-subsistence production to eat. Also, the elimination of the government agency called CONASUPO, which was the government agency that stored and distributed grain, led to the concentration of power around three major corporations, Cargill, Monsanto, Maseca, and Minsa. So now they became the main distributors and commercializers of corn. And their power over this market allowed them to hoard supplies and increase prices. So going back to the case of monetary policy, what was the response of Calderon to this increase in prices? He said, well, we're not going to increase wages. We're not going to provide subsidies. What we're going to do is that wages are going to stay the same because otherwise inflation is going to increase. And instead, what we're going to do is to have an agreement with these big producers and distributors to keep the price of corn a little bit lower, just a little bit. And in exchange, we're going to increase the quota of American corn that they can import from the United States. So this measure just basically benefited these big corporations. In the meantime, so the solution here for Calderon was not increasing small-scale agricultural production or increasing wages. It was keep wages down, even though prices increase, and have freer trade. So I'm going to be very short so we can go to the discussion. So again, I'm going to go back to the question of democracy. What does democracy mean in Mexico under Calderon now? On the one hand, we have these the imperatives of monetary policy, disciplining labor through wages, through low wages. And for me, this seems like a tendency towards economic authoritarianism, also linked to what you mentioned about this exposure of the Mexican economy